Hello there. Lately, I've been watching The Haunting of Hill House, the Netflix adaptation of Shirley Jackson's novel, which I read recently. And basically, like, it's completely different. But what they've done is they've taken, like, the names of the characters and certain images and feelings, and they've transposed them to an entirely new story. And I'm liking it. I'm liking it, although it's not as good as the book, but, like, I guess they rarely are. But the thing is that's interesting for me that they've got some like connections between the characters in the books and the characters in the show based on name. So, for example, I just watched the episode based around this character Eleanor, who is really different from the Eleanor from the book, but her experience in the house and some things about her character have these really interesting resonances. So I've been thinking a lot about different ways of portraying characters that feel trapped. And I made a little list, because why not? So here are 10 characters that felt trapped in some way or another, beginning with Eleanor from The Haunting of Hill House. She gets invited to participate in this, I guess, a kind of experiment, like a paranormal science-y experiment in a haunted house where she'll go there with 3 other people and have to just like observe a supernatural phenomenon as they occur and sort of like record it. So that's the premise. And the interesting thing for Eleanor is that while she seems like outwardly quite normal, really quickly at the beginning of the novel, we find out that this invitation to Hill House, it's almost like exactly what she's been waiting for, because she's had to take care of her sick mother for years and years and years, and her sick mother has died, and now she's sort of like, what do I do with my life? And suddenly she gets this invitation and she thinks, that's it, that's exactly what I need to just get away from this house, from my oppressive sister and her husband, and just kind of and just go and do something in the world and meet new people. So you've got this odd situation where going to the haunted house is sort of like this wonderful adventure, and most importantly, like, we see that it gives her a sense of like liberation. So that like immediately makes the haunted house setup, which is like really kind of stereotypical, right, a bit more interesting. That like one of the main characters who's going there actually sees it as like this wonderful escape from her life, right? So the haunted house, Hill House, you know, we normally see these things as like oppressive and like gloomy and scary, and often we're like shouting at the characters, just get out of the house, like why don't you leave, you know? And in this case it's so fascinating because like that whole premise is reversed, because the house is her source of freedom. At one point a character tells her, you know, if things start to get serious here, or you know, if anything actually dangerous starts to happen in this house, then of course you should go home, and you know, if we're worried about you, we'll send you home. And in her, you know, in her internal monologue, she thinks like, what home? You know, where would I go to? And that's where like the scariness of the novel lies, you know, this idea that, you know, Hill House is freedom. Like you can't escape from the house because the house is the escape. There's nothing beyond it. And you know, that obviously starts to become more freaky as things progress. Another character that I find really interesting, like regarding this theme, is Oedipus from the Greek myth, and specifically from the play by Sophocles, Oedipus Rex, or Oedipus the King, or Oedipus the Tyrant, or however you want to translate it. So the play begins in Thebes, and there's a plague, and it's going on, and it's just dragging, and people are sick of the plague, and like, when is the plague gonna pass so we can get on with our lives? Stop me if you've heard this before. The king himself, Oedipus, wants to know, what can I do to make the plague leave? So he talks to an oracle or a seer, and he's told that the old king, the previous king, was murdered, and that the murderer is still alive and in the city, and so he's polluting the city, and that's why the plague won't go away. So you have to once you get rid of that guy, then the plague will pass. And so Oedipus takes it upon himself, like, right, we're going to find that murderer, exile him, and then, you know, everything will be okay. This is like a really common mytheme, like, you know, a trope in myth, where you basically, especially the Greek myths, it's that like a character does something bad, usually murder, and then he's kind of polluted by his evil action, and then the place where he is also polluted, so he has to be exiled and then get to another place to be purified by that place's king, and only then kind of the consequences of his bad actions are dissipated. So Oedipus is like, a good king. He cares about his people. And even as he goes on, and it's kind of like a detective story in a way, even though we already know and like the audience would have already known what the answer is. But like Oedipus is just trying to do what's best for his city and his people to find this murderer. And as it goes on, more and more like messages and signs and people are sort of warning him against it and saying, you know what, maybe you should just drop this whole thing. Like, seriously, the consequences could be terrible for you if you find out who the murderer is. And he's like, no, I'm going to find this guy. And then, as most people know, and spoilers, I guess, although like, I think it's pretty clear from the beginning, shock horror, it's him. He's the murderer. And not only is that terrible news, but that means that another prophecy which was told to him, which he tried to escape, has also come true. And so he realizes that the things that he'd been running from all his life, and that, he thought he had defied fate and he was a free agent who was acting of his own free will all the time, whereas actually all the time he was trapped, and all the time the prophecies were coming true around him, and he was, just his whole detective story was just him discovering how trapped he had been by fate, and that every moment of what he thought was his freedom was actually part of a bigger design that he had fallen into. And it's a really harsh story, right? It's a really like particular way of being trapped, I think, this story, because he's happy all the way through. It's only at the end, this crushing realization, his freedom was actually trappedness that he was ignorant of. And yeah, it's pretty harsh. Thinking about Oedipus reminded me of another story which has got like a kind of similar vibe, I think, in some ways, which is Job, the story of Job from the Bible. Hear me out. Job is another absolutely fantastic trapped character, because his situation is even worse than Oedipus. Like if Oedipus seems like it's unfair because he's just trying to do what's best for his people and so on, then Job is like 10 times more unfair. Basically, for those who don't know the story, it's God and the devil are having a conversation, as I guess they do sometimes, and the God is like bragging about how how great his followers are, and the devil says that's just because they have good lives. If they suffered, then they would question you and your benevolence and all this stuff like that. I might be getting a little bit wrong, but I think the devil basically says to God, like, give me like a week or something, give me some time with one of your like devout followers and I will break him. Like, just give me even the person who you think is the one who is the most like devout, like believer in you, and he's really good and he loves you so much and all that stuff like that. Just give me a week with him, or however long it is, and I will make him doubt you and like doubt your benevolence and your power and all that stuff. And God is like, okay, game on. Here's Job, who is like one of the best people in the world, and he's so kind and loving and he loves God and blah blah blah. So yeah, do what you like with him. And so the devil just gradually, like piece by piece, ruins the life of Job, and God lets this happen. And the devil, first he kills all his crops, and then he kills all his servants or slaves, I guess, and then he kills all his children, and then his house collapses, and just eventually he gets to the point where he starts giving him these diseases, so his body becomes like really gross and he's like suffering every single day. And so eventually, he basically, the devil is right, he starts to snap and starts to challenge God and say, like, what's going on? Why do I deserve this? And for the reader, we know it's actually even worse than Job thinks it is, because he thinks that, oh, I was a good person, I never did anything bad, and yet I'm being punished in this way. And yet we know it's not just that he was a good person, it's that he was one of the best people, and that's why God is letting him be punished for this like bet that he made. So like, I really love this whole story. I find his challenge to God is like his defiance, and like the way that he rails against God about how unfair this whole thing is like really inspiring. And I think you can see it in other literature, and it also like, not only I think it like influenced a lot of like literature, but it's sort of like it reminds me of like Greek myths basically, and like the way that mortals like would often like be defiant against the gods and like question them about like why are they so messed up and why do they do all the like shitty things that they do. And that's just like, I think, a really powerful moment in a story, like the way that when the drama is about like a mortal standing up to a god and saying like, hang on a minute, that's not cool. And I don't know, I love it. Here's one which is a folktale, so it's kind of different because it's not like a set book, although I'm sure it's like in either Brothers Grimm or Hans Christian Andersen, one of those two. But it was one of the first things I thought of, which is the story of Rumpelstiltskin. I just, even though it's a folktale and so like it doesn't really fit the book thing that I'm going for here, it's just a great story of like trappedness, I think. And you know, it's a common theme in lots of folktales, I guess, but like this one in particular, I really like the way that the character is sort of trapped in different ways. So, you know, it begins, I don't know her name, I guess it changes in different versions, but basically like the king goes through a town and like a tailor or a cobbler or a miller or one of these like kind of peasant folk who says to the king, you know, like he brags about his daughter and he says, my daughter's so cool, she can spin straw into gold, you know, like at the loom or the wheel, the spinning wheel, right? And the king says, wow, that sounds great, I could do with more gold, so give me your daughter, I'll marry her. And so, you know, the miller realizes he's made a terrible mistake, but, you know, he's a shitty guy and that's it. The daughter has to be married off to the king. So that's the first way she's sort of powerless. And then the king puts her in a room and says, yeah, like, here's a room full of straw, spit it into gold, do it or I'll kill you the next day. So she's like trapped in this room overnight with all this straw and like this impossible task, and just crying. And then the creepy, freaky, elfy guy, Rumpelstiltskin, appears. And says, yeah, I'll help you do that. And then, you know, this pattern repeats of her being sort of like trapped and despairing and like, I'm going to be killed the next day. And then the magical freaky guy comes and helps her and then the room becomes gold and blah, blah, blah. And then, you know, like finally the king does marry her, but then Rumpelstiltskin wants his reward, right? He says like, okay, now you got to give me your baby and I'll only let you get out of this somehow if you guess my name. I'm really butchering this story, aren't I? Anyway, she has to guess his name, which she doesn't know. The thing that I really like about this story, I think, is the way that the girl like kind of like is at the mercy of these shitty men, and that it begins with, you know, her dad basically selling her off on a lie to be murdered, and then there's the king who's gonna kill her unless she can do something impossible, and then finally, you know, in the fairy tale usually the magic would save you, and it does, but also it's just another shitty man who, you know, wants her baby, and the best thing is she triumphs at the end of it. You know, she manages to get rich and be a queen and all this stuff, so she's still married to the potentially murderous king, but you know, what are you gonna do? At least she's like filthy rich and gets to keep her baby. Next one that I thought of was Emma Bovary, from Madame Bovary. Like, yeah, she's like, I guess, one of the classic trapped characters, right? Like, she's the archetype of the, you know, the woman trapped in a marriage where, you know, that was a bored housewife, let's put it that way, right? Like, she's in the provincial village and she has dreams of a better life and she's reading all these romantic novels and she wants a Prince Charming and she wants a life of adventure and you know, like to live fully as a lady and not be in this horrible provincial place where, you know, there's like a pig market and terrible things like mud. I think the whole thing was meant to be like a reaction against romanticism and like that whole literary movement. So, you know, it's kind of like making fun of these stories and like fairy tale like things where like, which are all about passion and emotion, and instead like, you know, just showing the real life as it is. But it's not, I don't know, if it was just this sort of cynical, anti-romantic cautionary tale, then I don't think I would like it, because, you know, I like the whole romantic stuff, right? I like these things. So even if it is like that, then there must be more to it, right? Because I really loved it. And yeah, I don't know why. I got to get back to Flaubert sometime. Next up is Raskolnikov, sticking with the classics here. Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. He's just the best. He's, you know, he commits a crime at the beginning of the novel and then the rest of it is him being punished for it. And he's so, like, angsty and, like, assertive and defiant and sure of himself and also, like, full of guilt. And he just walks around St. Petersburg in his big coat, like muttering to himself, and he's just the best character ever. He's an interesting case as well because like his trappedness is very much like his own kind of net that he's drawn around himself. Like he's always seen like on the borders of things, like he stops in doorways and stuff like that, and he goes like to the edge of town, St. Petersburg, and he just kind of like wanders around the edge, but then he always gets drawn back into the middle. So it's like it's not like there's some sort of like police cordon or something like surrounding him. Like there's only one bit in the novel that I remember where he's actually like trapped in the sense of he's like, you know, in a house and people are coming for him and he has to try and get out. Like for almost the whole thing, he's basically free to do whatever he wants, and yet he can't escape. You know, he has to stay in the town where he committed the crime. He has to keep talking to people about the crime. He has to keep almost giving himself away in conversation because like that's just who he is as a person. And you know, like he can't get away from the consequences of what he's done because of, you know, like some internal psychological aspect of who he is. It's such a claustrophobic novel without actually there being any walls in place apart from, you know, the ones that he constructs for himself. So yeah, that's a great one. He's also really similar to another protagonist who I don't know the name of from the book Hunger by Knut Hamsun. Hunger is again like there's a character and he's just walking around Oslo. The capital of Norway had a different name, I think, back in the day. But anyway, he's just wandering around and like, I don't know, like I'm a sucker for this. I'm a sucker for these impoverished men in big overcoats walking around the town as though it's like a prison or like they're a caged animal. Whereas actually the cage is just something that they've made up in their heads because of their feelings of inferiority or superiority or some weird combination of the two. Hunger is also a really great novel and it's much less well known than Crime and Punishment. So for people who like that, for people who like reading about self-destructive men in big coats, then yeah, you like Hunger, I think. The next one is The Manager of the Mine in Germinal by Émile Zola. And I looked up his name. His name is Philippe Ambeau. He is like a kind of, the novel is about working class kind of exploitation and how they end up rising up and protesting and, you know, the clash between the miners who are striking and then the owners. And Philippe Ambeau is sort of like in the middle. Because he, on the one hand, he doesn't own the mine, he just manages it, so he's, you know, not like of the very high upper class, but he's definitely like bourgeoisie and he's much more privileged than the workers. So even though he kind of understands the running of the mine and he's, you know, a bit more in touch with the lives of the people who work there, he's also like quite distant socially, and his conflicts are really different. He is stuck in a marriage where he loves his wife, but she doesn't love him. And in fact, she's having an affair with, like, I think his nephew. The thing that I really love about this novel is that you feel for him, even though he is in the sort of the exploiting class, and that, like, so much of the novel is dedicated to the workers and, you know, showing that the struggles that they go through and so on. And, like, you know, you have people literally starving in this novel, right? And yet, when I read it, I felt bad for this guy who's the manager of the mine because of the wife story, right? And like the scene which like was really striking for me, which really stuck with me, was I forget exactly what's happening, but he's listening to their demands and they're calling for bread. And, you know, it's a bit like the Marie Antoinette, let them have cake comment, right? He's sort of like, bread? Just bread? Like that's all they can think of, this simple thing. Like, what about, you know, like the heart? What about the soul? What about the passions? Bread is like such a basic thing, you know, like that. It's like, it's not real suffering. Like real suffering is like this, you know, what I'm going through this horrible suffering because it's emotional turmoil, you know, it's like my heart has been broken. I have to blah, 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 blah. So it's a lot of bullshit, but like the strength of the novel is that like I did feel really bad for him, and, you know, his situation is really sucky. And like, I realized when I read it that I, in a way, could feel more empathy, if not sympathy, empathy for his struggle because of my own life experiences and my own like class than I could for the starving miners. And yeah, that's just because it's something that, like, you know, I read it, I was quite young, I was like 20, I think. And yeah, I didn't have much life experience. But I think like basically the fact that I could relate so much to this character and at the same time realize how stupid his complaints were and how, you know, like how hypocritical he was, when, you know, like he obviously has all his base needs met, and so has the luxury of being able to be heartbroken, you know. That idea of seeing heartbreak as a luxury was something which was totally new to me. And like I feel like any teenager worth their salt these days is familiar with the concept of privilege, but like when I was a teenager, that wasn't like such a well-known term or concept, I think, at least among like my age group and my peers. And yeah, like this, although I didn't have those words at the time, I think this novel and this scene in this novel was the first time that I kind of understood my privilege and understood the concept of privilege, that, you know, like even just being able to like suffer in the way that this guy is suffering makes him a privileged character, and like makes me a privileged person as well. So like I wouldn't say the book like, you know, opened my mind to class consciousness or anything like that, or like radically politicized me or anything like that, but it definitely made me think about myself and about like kind of about privilege for the first time. So yeah, thank you Zola for Philippe Ombo. I felt like if I was doing this list I had to include something from either Poe, Edgar Allan Poe, or Cortázar. Julio Cortázar like kind of was really influenced by Edgar Allan Poe, and both of them are brilliant at drawing these characters who are like psychologically in their own cages, you know, like because everyone knows Edgar Allan Poe, I thought I'd do Cortázar instead because they're really like a similar kind of thing. I feel like when it comes to the trappedness of their characters, like beyond that they're totally different. But yeah, like I already talked about it in a different video, so I won't talk too long, but my favorite one of these kinds of characters is the narrator from Letter to a Lady in Paris, an epistolary short story, a guy who's taking care of his friend's apartment, and what happens is he vomits a small rabbit into his hand, and then he thinks, what should I do? Should I kill it? Should I sell it? And he decides he's going to keep it in the apartment. And then that's okay, he adjusts to this new life, and then another rabbit comes up, and so you know, he has to adjust again, and then another, and slowly he starts to lose sort of control of the apartment. It just gets at such great like kind of true feelings about you know, feeling like you're basically isolated and trapped in a room or in an apartment. Even though the thing that traps him is kind of external, the rabbits, it's also internal, like both literally coming out of his body, but also like you know, like as a manifestation of some psychological thing. But yeah, it's brilliant. It's one of my favorite short stories. So, you know, if you feel so inclined, then please check out Letter to a Lady in Paris. Next one is a girl from a comic called The Town Without Streets, or Michiganai Machi. Sounds much better in Japanese. Her name is Saiko, which, you know, in English sounds like it doesn't really bode well for her story, but the story is basically that, well, like lots of things happen. It's kind of dreamlike, but she's in her house and there's like a little hole in her wall and she sees an eye looking through it, and it's her brother's room. So she goes to her brother's room and she's like, what the hell? And he's like, what? I wasn't doing anything. And then she tells her parents and they're like, yeah, you know, like stop causing a fuss. Your brother wouldn't do that. Don't be weird. And then she finds another hole in after she's blocked that one up, she finds another hole in a different part of the wall, and like she sees an eye staring through, looking at her. So she freaks out again and she runs into the hallway, and like her dad or her mom or both of them are just standing there, and she's like, were you looking at me? And then no, why would we do that? Like don't be weird, like don't freak out, jeez. So it's really like paranoid, like this feeling of your own family just constantly spying on you, right? And there's always that little hole and like being drilled, and then just the eye staring through. So it's really freaky. And eventually she decides she just has to get out of that house, and she doesn't know where to go, so she'll go to stay with her aunt. So she goes to her aunt, and when she gets to her aunt's town, she finds that something weird has happened to the town. And this is like the best part of it, is this town. So basically what's happened is like all the streets have been covered up by buildings and structures. So everything has become a building. So anything that was an open space that you could walk around in has become now an enclosed space that you can like only walk in or walk through. And there's doors and there's windows and stuff like that. But basically the entire town has become like this, almost like a hive, right? Like everything is just passages. So if you want to walk from place to place, you often have to go through someone's house. So like, you know, like to get to from A to B, instead of going around a house, you'll often have to open someone's door or go through their window. And like, so all the routes that, you know, we normally, the way that we think about social space is basically completely messed up. And like, there's no sense of privacy anymore because everyone has to go through everyone else's living room as a way to sort of compensate for this huge loss of privacy that everyone has now. Everyone wears a mask. So everyone's walking around through everyone's houses and stuff like that, not speaking a word to each other and wearing freaky masks. So like, it's just like this weird nightmare town, and I love it. And the pictures are gorgeous. The best part of this manga is the images of the town and like just walking down all the passages and all the twists and turns, because it's basically like become a sort of labyrinth at this point. So like, what I love about the mangaka Ito Junji is that like he writes horror manga, but often he finds horror in the most unexpected places. So like In this case, we've got a horror of like kind of social space and like, you know, urban planning, things that you just wouldn't expect to be horrific. And also like communal resignation, you know, the fact that everyone just kind of, at first they kind of resist and they tear down the things, but eventually everyone just gives up and they're like, you know what, whatever, this is the new normal, this is how we live now. We have to go through each other's houses and everyone wears a mask, and just like people get used to it so fast. And that's scary, right? That's scary how like society can change like that. So yeah, if you're interested in like characterization and plotting, then this is not a great story because it's more just like thematic. You know, like the family thing doesn't really get resolved, I'm going to say right now. Instead, like it's more this girl moving from one situation to another, where the theme of like being exposed and like and privacy, you know, is like explored from different like in different visual settings, and it's brilliant and it's atmospheric, and it's like probably my favorite Ito Junji comic, and I recommend you check it out if you can. Some fun trivia about this comic is that these images of the sort of the nest-like labyrinthine town were inspiration for some video game designers who made a video game called Siren, or Forbidden Siren in Europe. And I picked this up randomly as a kid, and it got me into horror, and specifically Japanese horror. And then I wrote my master's thesis on Japanese horror movies, which were popular at the time. And that led to me doing a PhD in Japan, and here I am in Japan. So basically, if you just cut out that whole middle section, then the comic is the reason I'm in Japan. That's what I'm saying. Boy, it's gotten dark. So there you go, that is my list of 10 characters. I find that it's helpful often, like when people are going through tough times or negative emotions, to experience those in fiction and to like kind of read about characters who are going through similar feelings, even if the situations are like vastly different. Because I guess like there can be something quite cathartic in that, you know, seeing those emotions, you know, exaggerated and like kind of pushed to extremes. And also just like I find it can help like work through your own feelings or like kind of understand yourself a bit better. So hopefully like this list could be helpful for somebody maybe. You know, especially now with the pandemic stuff, there's a lot of people who are isolating or isolated or, you know, trapped in various different ways, whether it's because of lockdowns or quarantines or what have you. For me personally, like I have been feeling very free and happy lately, and that made me reflect on and realize that in around like August and beginning of September, I was going through a pretty tough time for various reasons. Like, you know, some things were like, you know, reading a disturbing book, Hang Kang. But one of the big ones that like I really noticed afterwards was the fact that the Japanese immigration basically stopped people from coming back into Japan if you don't have a Japanese passport, you know. So if I were to leave with a Japanese friend, then the Japanese friend would be allowed back in, but I wouldn't be allowed back in. So basically that meant that I couldn't leave Japan for the whole time. And, you know, there's some countries which do this for everybody, and there's some countries which do this for nobody. But I don't know any other country which does this like kind of discriminatory thing of having, you know, like if you're a national, you can come and go, but if you're a foreigner, then you can't come back in. So like, I don't know, maybe a lot of countries do this, but I haven't read about any that do this yet. So if you know them, let me know, because I'd be curious. Because for me, it's just super discriminatory, because like obviously the virus doesn't care what country you come from, right? The point is that like I've been planning to see my family. We were supposed to meet early in 2019. We hadn't met in almost 3 years. Now it's been over 3 years. So obviously I know loads of people's plans have got messed up because of the virus stuff. But I think in particular, this feeling that I couldn't leave Japan because then I would be stuck outside of it and possibly not able to return made me feel really trapped. And the reason that I, you know, just added to my stresses and stuff. And like, yeah, I think in August, I even got like a weird like rash across my forehead, which disappeared after a week because like at the end of that week was when they changed the laws. So like, it's amazing how these things affect you. But yeah, the immigration laws got changed at the very, very end of August. And they kind of kept it on the down low. Like I haven't seen it in the press really or anything like that. But yeah, so they ended this discriminatory policy where now people can come and go. And so as well as that, I also got my visa, which sort of makes me more stable here, which means that I can feel more comfortable in leaving, knowing that I will definitely be able to come back, unless, you know, some other rules change, because, you know, the whole virus thing is very unpredictable at the moment. Like this summer, I've been replaying like one of my favorite video games called Papers, Please, which is in which you play an immigration officer, and at one point in the game there's a polio, I think, outbreak. There's some kind of outbreak, and at first the government says like you can't let people into the country who come from the affected area, but then as the virus spreads, they say, okay, everybody has to have a vaccine certificate, whether they come from that country or this country or anybody, nationals, non-nationals, everyone needs a vaccine certificate. And I thought that's just so fair. And the Papers, Please is like kind of like a caricature of a totalitarian state. And I thought like they've got more, like this cartoon version of a totalitarian state has more fair immigration laws regarding a virus than the country I live in right now. So that was like pretty funny, I thought, in a dark way. What are you gonna do though? Glory to arstotzka, right? But yeah, it's a great game, by the way. Play it if you're interested in stuff, in anything. It's just a great game. Everyone should play it. But yeah, basically the Japanese immigration system was weird and sucky and discriminatory, and now it's changed and I have a visa, so everything is much more secure, and I've been able to reflect on those things, and also like reflect on how lucky I am that I'm not stuck, you know, in my house in the way that lots of people are, or I'm not stuck in an abusive relationship or something like that, you know. So like again, like privilege, right? We come full circle. Although that wasn't the beginning, that was the middle, but still. So those are my thoughts on 10 characters who are trapped in an array of different ways. I hope you found this interesting, and thank you for listening to my ramblings as usual. Hope you're all healthy and well and feeling fantastic. Bye-bye.